three wonderful speakers. I would like to run through a few housekeeping topics. So when you're not speaking, please keep your mic off. If you do wish to contribute, please raise your hand through the feature on Zoom, and you can drop your question into the chat. In terms of structure, we'll have a little introduction from our three speakers, have a few discussion points, as well as some polls for you to take part in. We'd also invite you to make any comments or questions that you might have. So please look at the Q&A chat box on your screen. And if you think of a question at any point, you're more than welcome to type it in there, or you can come off mute and ask it directly to one of our speakers. In terms of recording, as you just heard, we will be recording today's event, and we'll make that available to everyone after the roundtable, and how you can also get in touch with us. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our three wonderful presenters. We have Helen Pettifer. Helen is a consultant helping businesses to better understand vulnerability. We have Steve Crabbe. Steve is a consultant, non-executive director, and the chair of Energy UK's Vulnerability Commitment. And we also have Helen Lord, the Chief Executive Officer at the Vulnerability Registration Service. So now I'm going to hand the floor over to Helen Pettifer, who's going to get started today. Helen, if you'd like to introduce yourself, it's all yours.
Yes, good morning. Thank you, Ryan. So good morning, everybody. I'm Helen Pettifer. I work with organisations on helping them with their vulnerability strategies and ultimately training their teams to be able to pick up and identify vulnerability and how they can support customers who may need additional support. So I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. Sort of data and digital journeys is a really hot topic at the moment for discussion. So really interested to hear what Helen and Steve have to share, as well as Ryan. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Helen. Steve, if you'd like to say a few words.
Yeah, so thanks, Helen, and thanks for that introduction, Ryan. So as Ryan said, I chair Energy UK's Vulnerability Commitment, which is a voluntary code that energy suppliers can sign up to, which is designed to drive continuous improvement in support for customers in vulnerable circumstances. So this year, 14 suppliers participated in it, of whom 12 are still in the market, representing over 70% of all households in the UK. So it's great to see so many energy companies taking vulnerability really seriously. And yeah, I'm passionate about the importance of finding ways to identify vulnerability in all its different formats, and making sure that organisations really understand customers' needs.
Fantastic. Thank you, Steve. And next, Helen Lord, if you'd like to.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, so I'm Helen Lord. I think I've spoken to most of you. It's a great group of people out there. So Vulnerability Registration Service, if you don't know, what we basically do is we have created and continue to create a database to help organisations cross-sector identify vulnerability in individuals, treat them appropriately. And I think a big part of what we do is hopefully to collaborate with organisations to try and reach the same goals, really, and to make sure we can gradually cross-sector address some of the issues out there.
Okay. Great, thank you very much. So just to kick us off today, I thought we'd best start with a poll, just to get the sort of cogs turning. So Nikki, if you'd like to flash that up for us. So you'll see this on your screen just now. Question is, what is your biggest challenge around identifying vulnerable customers? We have lack of agent training or confidence, lack of call coverage, data protection, security, lack of investment. So what we're talking about there is budget for teams or board level buy-in.
A few more seconds, just any last answers in.
Okay, great. So from that poll, we have 57% indicating that the biggest challenge around identifying vulnerable customers is lack of agent training and confidence. 14% said lack of call coverage, 40% data protection and security, and 14% I think that is due to lack of investment from budget or board. Okay, that's really interesting. I mean, you know, in terms of a panel, Steve, Helen Lord, do you have any thoughts on that at all?
I mean, I think it's interesting, really. I think talking to lots of people about this, there's all sorts of different, all those factors come into play. And when I mentioned collaboration at the start of this, I think that's why it's so important. The thing I actually see more of than anything else is a data protection fear, but I guess that's because I'm talking about data sharing as much as anything. And I mean, I'm sure Helen sees the other side of the coin much more than me, because she's obviously talking about training. And I noticed we've got Chris Jones from VCX on as well. He would probably mirror that.
Okay.
Yeah, so building on that, I'd say that the other thing I'd probably add to the list is reluctance of customers to actually disclose. I think there's terrible fear out there still. And there's a legacy, I'm sure, of like people's grandparents' experiences of hiding behind the sofa when the rent collector called, you know, if you didn't have the money. And it's not that long ago that energy companies would routinely disconnect people if they didn't pay their energy bills, but those days are thankfully gone. And now we've got a real disconnect between people's understanding of the support that is actually available from many different types of organizations, and therefore their willingness to actually disclose when they've got problems. And so the more that we can actually sort of help them by automating the process or finding ways to capture those signals when they do indicate, that's critically important.
And I think, Steve, you just raised a point that I've noticed in looking at how our database is constituted, and the recent survey we did. Older people are more reluctant to put the hand up and say we're in a vulnerable situation. We're seeing far more younger people, very young people in some cases, who will identify as vulnerable, will identify as having mental health issues. So there is a generational thing there, though clearly, you know, there is likely to be far more vulnerability in the elderly. So I think we have to find ways of picking that up from them that isn't necessarily, as you say, from them saying so themselves.
And I think a lot of it comes from trust, isn't it? I think, I mean, a lot of my customers are insurance companies. So, of course, when customers disclose that they may have something particular going on in their life, they might automatically think that it might impact their ability to get an insurance cover, or it may impact their premium. So it's kind of building that trust that actually you're sharing that information because there is support available. It's not going to be just sort of swept under the carpet. It's not just going to be lost in a void. It's actually that information is going to be used for the benefit of that relationship with that organisation and how they can support that individual.
Yeah,
I guess the other thing is that the terminology we use, and I noticed Carolyn's on, and I think Carolyn raises quite often, is vulnerable a word that people want to use, and I don't know what the alternative is, unfortunately, and it's talked about all the time, but there is still some stigma, and I do think, you know, we have to find ways of helping people and identifying it without sort of expecting somebody to put themselves in a category, I guess.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that leads us quite nicely on to our first question, really, about technology applications and which technology applications we've seen that, or what technology applications that we've all seen that have been rolled out and been effective in improving the identification of vulnerable customers, or customers that would identify or being in vulnerable situations. So Steve, Helen, have you seen anything? Is there anything out there that's currently aiding businesses in being able to identify these customers?
I mean, I see it as having component parts, and again, working together. Everybody's trying to achieve the same goal. So, I mean, exactly what you do, Ryan, around all the things when we're communicating with people, trying to identify key ways of seeing if somebody is vulnerable in that way, the training that we can do to help customer service staff, etc., know what they're looking for. There are really good models being built out there to find indicators of vulnerability. And I mean, obviously what we do is we try and show the individuals that we have identified as vulnerable for the period they have. Now, I think all of those things together need to gradually work together more and more to achieve that common goal. I think there's a danger that we want an answer to a situation which we're never going to find a total answer to, but I think there's ways of starting to address issues and gradually working our way through it. And the worst thing we can possibly do is not start to act.
I think quite an interesting thing for me in the technology side here is when you think about vulnerability, as you say, it's kind of we're trying to do one size fits all here, but ultimately it's often changing. New vulnerabilities are emerging and stuff, and the interesting thing is how organisations are then, I suppose, communicating these new vulnerabilities back to the people who are dealing with the individuals. And I mean, I'm not entirely sure what the current process is. Is it kind of finding out quite after the fact that there's a new vulnerability emerging, rolling out a whole training programme around that, communicating it to the staff so they know what to do? How often are they having to do that? How often are they having to keep that alive? And I think where technology can be a wee bit different is hopefully you can start to see trends that are emerging. You've got indicators that are coming up that are saying, do you know what, we're beginning to see a recurring problem here. This is something that we need to kind of link to. Our customer service agents don't know how to handle that. They've never had to handle it before. Let's roll out a scheme. Let's try and support them to be able to handle that situation of this vulnerability. And I think that for me is the big kicker, because ultimately the person who's having to deal with the vulnerability is always going to be the individual. So it's about supporting the contact centre agent to deliver it. So yeah, it seems like quite a big ask for organisations to be constantly evolving their training materials for this.
Yeah, I think, Jamie, that's spot on, and that's why the kind of the latest stage in the evolutionary ladder of vulnerability is inclusive design and inclusive service. You know, we started probably 10 years ago. If you mentioned consumer vulnerability, people would have pictured a binary situation where you were either vulnerable or not vulnerable. And then we came up with the concept of transient or temporary vulnerability and an understanding that people can dip in and out of it. And then the next sort of stage in the thinking was about, well, actually vulnerability is about risk factors. It's about what happens when a risk circumstance or a characteristic you've got, like maybe sight loss or hearing loss or something like that, the needs that come from that are not met by the service provider. That's what makes you vulnerable. It's not inherent in you, it's what the organisations that serve you do or don't do to you, right? And then finally, we've got now to inclusive design, inclusive service, where ideally what you want to do is empower your people to actually be able to say to customers, what do you need? Okay, I'll sort it for you, you know, because if we try to salami slice the customer base and put everybody into neat little boxes according to vulnerability, you know, it's so complex, because you can have people who've got multiple different forms of vulnerability, you know, none of which actually impair their ability. Some of the most confident and successful people I know have got, you know, profound hearing or sight loss, and they're not vulnerable at all. But to come back to Ryan's question, yeah, I'd like to focus on digital, but actually before I do that, here's a nod to the good old telephone, because one of the things that the vulnerability commitment asks of all participating energy suppliers is that they have to provide free phone telephone numbers for customers in financial hardship, you know, and there is an assumption, we've got an assumption that if you're over 70, you use the telephone, right? And if you're in your 20s, you probably communicate using TikTok. Well, it's not true. There's an inverted bell curve. Actually, people in their 20s are more likely to use the telephone than people at any other stage in their lives until you actually get to 70 again. and in between, you know, we get into digital as a preferred medium, but both young and old, where vulnerability is often concentrated, love using the telephone. So it has to continue to have a place, and voice has to continue to have a place. But the biggest technology, one of the most transformative technologies for me is simply digital accessibility. So solution providers like Recite Me that enable users to be able to translate your digital content into 130 different languages, to change the alphabet into Cyrillic or Arabic, or to change the color schemes, because people with dementia, right, can see certain colors better than others, to increase the point size and the font to make it more legible. I mean, all of these things, you know, pretty basic, but actually can make a massive difference to people's ability to access the information and the services that they need. So that for me has been a real biggie.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that, Steve, as well. A lot of tools around that, and then also you've got sort of analytics around speech, words and phrases, trigger words that customers may share, and the sentiment as well, whether that's spoken verbally or whether that's through the web chat. And I think as well, it's knowing when web chat robot actually steps aside, and then that human sort of takes over that conversation. It's knowing that sort of real fine line of actually when that customer is okay to carry on with that, or whether they actually do need to have that human interaction, or even be able to sort of come off again from that web chat and take it onto that telephone call, like Steve was sharing. One thing I've found as well with organisations that I've been dealing with is they're putting a lot of tools in place on the agent side. So there'll be pop-up questions, there'll be sort of pop-up questions around the Bruce model, there'll be pop-up questions around the Texas model. You may also have some vulnerability toolkits, so you can sort of have an A to Z of certain situations or conditions. So actually, if then a trigger word is mentioned, that agent can just click into sort of, you know, the alphabet D and then go into dementia, and then it sort of all has some responses and some signposting, and those have been really, really helpful as well to sort of aid the agents through those calls.
I've seen lots of interesting ones, like, and we've done a few now of these type, joined a few of these webinars, and there's quite a lot of technology players out there, and there's like, one of the interesting ones I've seen was ultimately the so what after. So a lot of the focus here is on identification, but ultimately, kind of when someone is identified as vulnerable, what resources are available to them out there outside of that organisation to kind of match that individual up with the help that's required. And I've seen some technology out there that effectively is, if a certain vulnerability comes up, these are the local charities that can support it. All of that would need to be backed up by the organisation as having their chosen path. But then you get into the realms here of, as you mentioned earlier, kind of vulnerability is a word that everyone wants to associate with. And even if someone is in some form of financial distress or whatever, they maybe don't want to kind of have to share that information with multiple different parties all the time to explain it again. So the ability, I suppose, to join up the outsource providers who can offer help with the actual organisation is actually quite a big thing, you know, a seamless transition of passing someone over to get the help that is required, alongside the context of the conversation that's happened today.
I think you're absolutely right, Jamie. I mean, I bet Chris is biting at the bit in the background here, because I mean so I mean, a lot of what VCX do is exactly that. They've got a signpost which points people in exactly the right direction. So you've got call centre people who might have words thrown at them that typically they wouldn't know what somebody is saying they have got, if you like, and it gives them that indication and it gives them that level of information. But I mean, I have had several conversations in the last week with major banks, and I think one of the biggest things is, yes, we talk about identifying vulnerability, and we've got a long way to go with that. I don't think we're doing it on the whole. We're starting to, but then the next question is what do we do when we've identified vulnerability? And I think there's a lot of I don't know is the answer. We found that this person has a mental health issue, or we found that this person is a victim of coercion. now how do we treat them? And I think part of the premise of what we built originally was trying to give that interaction between different organisations so those conversations could happen. I think the fear factor has always been how many times is that going to happen, and is it going to be manageable? I think the reality is it's probably going to be more by exception than anything else. But yeah, there is an awful lot of, there are going to be exceptions, and those are going to have to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. There isn't going to be an answer to everything, but I think there is more education that can be done and more information out there in terms of identifying what to do with people once we found the issue.
Yeah. And I'm actually working with a client at the moment, and we're looking at vulnerability flags and actually sort of working out what those flags should be, because I think it's really important that that flag is given the right title, I guess, rather than actually sort of a diagnosis. So sort of maybe move away from sort of, okay, this is a mental health flag, this is a health condition flag. We're labeling that customer. Actually, what does that customer need from you? What support is available? Do you need to know that information? Because actually, yes, they may have a mental health condition, but is it impacting the way that they communicate with you? Is it impacting the way that they access your products and services? If not, then they don't need a flag.
And it comes back to that definition, doesn't it?
Yeah,
that definition thing, which everybody's struggled with for a very, very long time, I think. And how far do you go? How much detail do you go into? And I mean, we eventually, I think we've got about 13 flags at the moment, and they are high level, and they've drawn from conversations, they've drawn from what the FCA have done, and they try and cover everything. But we have to be completely flexible, and Helen, I'd be really interested in that conversation, because I think it's something that has to be developed as we move forward.
Yeah. And we've actually reduced it down to 3 flags now, because actually they started with 31. And and the idea is that actually we need to support those agents. It's the agents who are doing that hard work, are having those really difficult conversations. They have a huge amount to focus on during that call. How can they actually process 31 drivers or 31 flags?
But then you've got your priorities. I mean, Stephen far more about this than me, but you've got your priority service registers, which the utilities used, and I think there's 30 something of those at the moment, and they have to be granular, don't they, really? They need to know certain situations, and I think those are relevant, and we're having these conversations, but they are relevant to other sectors as well. I think some of the flags and the identifiers that utilities deal with are equally relevant to, say, social housing or...
So interesting when you said there, Helen, that you sort of reduced those flags, and that's really to sort of benefit and aid the agent. And we've discussed this before, I believe, when we're talking about certain flags that would be a little bit more subtle in terms of, coming out and saying, I'm actually dyslexic, and there's a capability issue there. But when someone maybe phones up their energy supplier and starts talking about putting food on the table, for instance, or, being able to buy winter coats, winter jackets, and that they're actually potentially flags for vulnerability. But as you've just sort of said, it's quite difficult for the agent to be present in the call, but also look through these lists of 30 or so, vulnerability flags, as well as be present in the conversation. And then, those 30 or so vulnerability flags could quite easily be 100 or 150, if you start thinking about phrases that are a little bit more subtle. So I think from our experience, the use of, technology such as natural language and speech processing can greatly improve that, allow the agent to be present within the call, and then actually, you give them the help they need during the call, but also these flags can be sort of, or these terms can be flagged up after the call. Yeah. And it's something that can feed back into business decision making in terms of product, service, customer, process, but also should be used as a tool by businesses to identify staff training. I think when they need more development on a particular issue, or how to recognise these more subtle phrases, I think is really important. And I think the use of that technology can certainly aid that.
Yeah, right. So Ryan, just to build on that. So so one thing I found when I was heading up vulnerability at British Gas was that agents often stop at the first vulnerability. particularly if they're looking for qualifying factors for something like warm home discount, which is a financial benefit for financially vulnerable customers. So there's an opportunity there to capture lots of information about a customer's needs, but because all they're trying to do there is make sure that the customer gets their 140 quid discount this winter, it's like job done, because I've ticked that first box, right? So when we went back over it, we found that actually they were missing lots of triggers. But you are absolutely right. I think the utility sector is very much sort of bound by the priority services register, which is now kind of common across water and energy, which feels really old school, because it's essentially about identifying people who need energy or water to power medical equipment in the home, and the assumption being that there's going to be regular power outages. It almost feels like something that could have been designed back in the 1970s, rather than kind of back in the noughties. For me, if I was starting with a blank sheet of paper, I'd be looking to flag service needs, not the conditions that drive them, because so many service needs actually ladder up to the same, or so many different vulnerabilities ladder up to the same service need, right? It doesn't matter whether the customer's got dementia, mental health, well-being issues, low educational attainment. If the solution is really clear bills that are simple and easy to understand, that's the service need. So you don't need to be going into intrusive detail about their exact circumstances. Although, having said that, there may be some situations where the customer actually feels that it's really important to have their circumstances recognised as a matter of their kind of human rights. So we mustn't be casual about that as well.
Definitely. But I guess then, Steve, my question to that is how would you recognise what a customer might need unless you sort of have that conversation and you understand the need initially? So how do you decide that someone needs really sort of clear bills, or the bills of Braille, for instance, unless you have that discussion with the customer?
So having said that, kind of don't salami slice the customer base and try to kind of identify every possible vulnerability under the sun and have a flag for it. Actually, I think one thing that really, really works is talking to customers with lived experience, and do focus groups with customers with mental health and well-being issues. Really important report published this morning by Money and Mental Health, by the way, if you get a chance to go and look at that. Customers with hearing loss, sight loss, older customers in financial hardship, you don't need to do many of those before you start getting really, really good insights into what large numbers of customers actually need. And guess what? It's if you actually get customers telling you what their customer experience is like, rather than getting a load of white blokes in suits in a room guessing, it's so much more effective.
I'm going to be thinking about it a lot. I like that kind of that lens of ultimately what's the outcome here, what does the customer need, and that's the whole point of doing it. One of the interesting things, I suppose, that we often find is we actually do, so we've got a very low level of kind of potential vulnerability in there, kind of aligned to the FCA guidance, and kind of almost partner to partner, we're prioritising that low level, i.e. prioritising a vulnerability, which is an interesting concept, and it's often different from organisation to organisation, depending on kind of what type of customers they've got, like what their market is, etc. But I suppose when you think about rolling up to a service proposition, do you lose that prioritisation? Should there be a prioritisation? That's an interesting area.
It's interesting what you just said, Steve, because I was listening to what you were saying, and I was saying, well, a lot of this is just down to really good customer service, isn't it? I mean, we're making it complicated. We're trying to identify vulnerability, but if we provide a really strong level of customer service, work on the basis that most of us aren't brilliantly technically savvy, we've got a fairly good idea. Most of us want to be able to get through to somebody on the end of the phone without pulling our hair out and going through endless sort of options. Maybe that sort of addresses quite a lot of the issues, and that would perhaps give us, if we got that right, then maybe we would have the resources and energy to focus on those genuinely special cases of really vulnerable people that do need those special needs.
We had a few questions come in. Hannah, I'm not sure if you want to come off mute and ask a question and pose it to one of the speakers yourself, or I can read it out if you'd like.
It's a challenge that we're facing at the moment because there's so many different opinions, but we're also looking into the vulnerability flags as well, and had a similar conversation as Helen mentioned into how broad or how specific do you make them so that you get useful information from them, but then you don't have lists of hundreds and hundreds. But a question that keeps popping up is then at what stage do you then review them? If you mark that customer with a flag, then how regularly should we be contacting them to check that that still applies, or reviewing their case and amending those details? Because if we just put the flag on and then never touch it again, is it of value because their circumstances may have changed?
And this is one of the questions I was having with this client, in that, actually, at what point do we offboard that vulnerability flag? And again, it's sort of it's worth really identifying what the point of that flag is, because again, sort of if it might be a short-term vulnerability, if someone's just broken their arm or broken their leg and they're not able to work, and maybe they don't qualify for full pay or sick pay, it might be a very short vulnerability, as they might just miss one payment or a couple of payments. Again, and as such, does that need a sort of a long-term flag? So it's really sort of about sort of identifying what that individual needs. And I think as well, you do need to go back and have those conversations with those customers to just make sure that actually is that still relevant. The three flags that we've got it down to with this client is communication, affordability, and resilience. They're the three. And what we looked at, I mean, I spent hours sort of looking at all of their support that's available and all of what the customers need from that organization, and that's how we got it down to those three. So they might need their communication adapted. It might be that they need longer on the phone. It might be that they need braille or large print, or they might actually prefer you to just not call them and actually just send everything through email. So again, that's sort of potentially those things, when it comes up and that customer calls up, you just touch base and say, oh, notice that you've got some preferences around the way that we communicate with you. Can I just double check that that's still relevant, or whether we need to maybe make changes to it? So again, you're not highlighting their diagnosis or their circumstance or their condition. You're actually sort of saying, is our level of support still necessary for you? Is that still relevant for you? Has that changed? And again, with regards to affordability, is that going to be a short-term problem to pay their payments with you, or is that actually a longer term that you need to look at that? And again, maybe sometimes you can maybe set up some automated exit markers actually at a certain point. If they've made 3 payments, excuse me, on time, 3 monthly payments on time, could that then automatically, that flag be taken off without sort of communicating with them? So again, it's thinking outside the box with regards to all that.
Is that currently normal practice? Like, as it stands just now, when someone is flagged as a vulnerability, often in these organisations, the agents or customer service reps have the remit to quit. I suppose they'll have a flag and they'll know they're vulnerable, but is it part of their remit to delve back into that after each conversation? Is that what we see happen in organisations?
It's something I'd definitely like to see put into organisations. It's that those frontline agents have the confidence and the skills to actually sort of start that conversation. But again, it's sort of making sure that terminology of that flag is in a way less offensive, to actually to bring it back up into the conversation. So you, for example, if you say to a customer, they shared 6 months ago that they were struggling mentally, actually it could be far more challenging 6 months down the road to sort of start bringing that up into conversation again with that individual. But actually, if you think about that person, if they, in the initial circumstances, if they then disclose that actually, I'm really struggling with my mental health at the moment, the agent then says, I'm, really sorry to hear that. Thank you for letting me know. How is that impacting you? Is that going to impact the way that you communicate with us? Do you want us to change the way we communicate with you? Is that going to impact the way that you make your payments? You know, do you want us to look at short-term, long-term payment plans? You know, is that affecting, you know, your ability to cope? You know, so that's what we're looking at as an with this client as an organization. So then in 6 months' time, you can just sort of say, oh, I noticed from your account you're on a, you know, long-term payment plan. You know, is that still relevant? Are you still managing to be able to afford those payments?
But there's one energy supplier who they organise their customer service agents in the pods of, I think there are eight agents in a pod, and each pod looks after a certain number of customers, like 10,000 or something like that, I think. And you always get through. If whichever pod you're attached to, you always get through to one of the team members. So, and most customers don't transit, you know, they self-serve, right? They don't get in touch. They don't need to. So, but the ones who keep coming back will always speak to those 8 people who are empowered to do everything, end-to-end customer experience. And that works really, really well, because customers who've got particular vulnerabilities do keep coming back. Right?
Yeah.
Other organisations, you know, are equally good, but they have highly specialised teams and ensure that, you know, customers with specific needs will be passed over to those. It's whatever works for your business model. But I think that, you know, generally I find that organisations are able to turn off average handling time metrics and actually get it, you know, concentrate on right first time. Generally provide a better customer experience. So I'm a big fan of that if you can do it. But I know that it takes a lot of confidence, basically, to sort of hold your nerve when you see the average handling times initially skyrocket. But you know, once you reach cruising altitude, the benefits are undeniable.
That leads us nicely, I think, on to a sort of second question. So thanks very much, Steve and Helen, for your sort of responses to the first one. So we spoke about the importance of technology and identifying customers that might be in vulnerable circumstances, but what about the importance of human element? So what about, you know, agent skills, soft skills versus technology?
So I'm happy to go first if that's okay. So I think, I mean, it's critically important. What I've found that works really, really well is when you can tap into people's passions and you can turn them into champions, basically. And I've seen that work in a number of organisations I've worked with really, really well. So at British Gas, we created, I think it was 20,000 dementia friends through a dementia champions program. Basically, we started by finding those people who've been touched by dementia in their own families and their own lives and feel passionate about it and want to make a difference. And then we were able to send them out. Alzheimer's Society does free training courses, last a day, to equip people to be dementia champions. And then those dementia champions went out and they ran training sessions for team leaders. And then the team leaders delivered dementia friends. I presume most people on the call know what that is. It's basically an awareness program, not a training program, but an awareness program that can help people to be more sort of empathetic towards customers with dementia and their carers. And so they rolled it out to their own teams during downtime team talks when there was nothing to be briefed out. So they'd only been shown their holiday snaps. So there was no impact to the business, no cost to the business. It took us 1.5 years. You know, I know one major bank did it in a week because the chief executive decided to do it top down. And so ran a series of videos, everybody in the company, you know, bam, great if you can do that. But we did it through the back channels, you know, senior leadership were aware, but, you know, but it didn't have any impact on the business. So it was very easy to get it through, but it was that passion of those dementia champions. And another, you know, Bulb, sadly have gone into special measures, but they created vulnerability champions. Again, we're tapping into people who were passionate about whatever the issue was. Might have been mental health and well-being, might have been dementia or whatever. But they then made sure that they provided the specialist support to their colleagues in the different customer service teams. So that works really well. The other thing I think is critically important in terms of the soft skill stuff is making sure you align what you do for your people with what you do for your customers, right? So many organizations have mental health first aider programs for their staff, and then maybe get Mind in to do some training on customer service side of things. And actually, if you recognise that take a 360-degree approach to this, recognise that, but particularly, you see it's a lot of energy where some of the challenger brands have got very young, highly educated, super bright, super caring people on the telephones who initially come into an organisation that is largely serving millennials who don't have complex needs and do most of their, mostly self-serve online. And then increasingly, as time goes on and they get more customers, the number of customers with challenging circumstances increases, the number of tough calls that these young people have to take increases, and the effect on their mental health and well-being is staggering. Absence rates can be really, really high. And so, you need to understand the effect. I think it was mentioned earlier, possibly by Carolyn, but you need to understand that it works both ways.
I think I agree. I agree totally. I mean, the question around, technology can streamline things. It can point in the right direction. It can help us identify potential vulnerability. It can help us identify vulnerability. But people are absolutely individuals, and at the end of the day, there is going to have to be an element of curtailing how people are treated. I think what Steve says about the tapping into the passion of people is absolutely essential. Everybody has got either their own personal experience or one person away from having an experience around vulnerability. I mean, it's certainly part of what has driven me through doing this. And I think if you can tap into those individuals and help them to relate to that, and I'm sure Helen does this all the time when she, in terms of training, but it's making it relatable to people and really capitalising on that, I think.
I mean, I love that concept of tapping into people's experience and passions, and I think obviously if you can do that, you're going to get much better outcomes. When you were saying that before, Steve, one thing really sprung to mind for me, and that is, what about outsourced contact center relationships? Like, if you're outsourcing your contact center, do you lose that level of influence over your customer service operations? Because the CEO can have the passion and it can come top down, but then you go through this infrastructure of outsourcing, you go through service level agreements, you go through cost per interactions, and actually, can that get lost? And this is something that companies really need to think about going forward as a cost of outsourcing.
Yeah, totally. And this I think is why speech analytics and natural language can be so important, because I experienced this in a former company of agents who are offshored as well as outsourced. And in these contact centres in South Africa, there were agents there who had lost a limb because their parents had cut it off so that they could beg more effectively when they were a small child. And living in Soweto, where the electricity runs for about 4 hours a day, trying to understand customers in England, we're talking about, heat or eat decisions. The experience is just so utterly different. There was another organisation I worked with where we were doing some call listening, and that somebody said, I can't come to the phone right now, I've lost my husband. And the agent said, I'm terribly sorry, I hope you find them. It's like they just didn't understand, the idiom in that case. But it can work really, really well. I've worked with outsourced operations, both contact center and field, actually, that fully understand the values. And if you put in the right controls, it can easily be done. So when we did Dementia Friends of British Gas, we had outsourced contact center in Rotherham at Capita. They all became Dementia Friends, fully on board. They were just as passionate as those who were directly employed. So it's really about how much effort you put into it. But within the energy on field basis, I've watched smart meter installations done by outsourced contractors who come in, fully brief the customer on energy efficiency, look out for vulnerability, scrupulously record it. And I've observed installations done by people who wouldn't know vulnerability if it was sitting opposite them in an armchair. You know, it's how much effort you put in, I think, is absolutely critical.
Yeah, it feels to me that there's a natural friction between the nature of outsourcing, the way these contracts are managed, and then, as you mentioned in the previous question, the comfort in watching average call handling times go up, knowing that that's at a cost of better customer service and better managed vulnerable customers. And I'm just not sure from what we see that this type of, you know, the way these relationships are managed really accounts for that. It's very much SLA. These are your performance metrics. You're not hitting them. Why? Yeah, it just
I think
feels
as
like
well, it comes down to sort of scripting as well, doesn't it? I think probably a lot of outsourced centres as well probably give their agents, their call handlers, you know, scripts, you know, potentially with the option to sort of, you know, come off script a little bit to sort of be authentic and genuine and have their natural tone of voice. But again, it's sort of, you know, if you do provide you know, processes or questions that agent needs to go through, you know, give them the ability to actually not read it as is, but actually, you know, how does that naturally sound for you in a conversation, to sort of actually give them training on actually, you don't need to ask every single question, you know, before, you know, you might need to just adapt that conversation actually by answering one question. That customer might have already answered another question that you were going to ask. So it's kind of giving those staff the skills to actually not read it verbatim, or not follow that script or that process verbatim, but to have that ability and autonomy and know that they're not going to get into trouble by coming off script or by bringing in that human authenticity into that conversation.
Caroline made a very good point there in the comments as well, just talking about outsourcing in these outsourcing businesses. It's a good example of when vulnerability becomes more than just a customer experience, customer service role, sorry. You know, it should follow the sort of same relationship within procurement, supplier managers, to create a sort of good foundation, which I think is a great point. You know, if you're using a business to talk to your customers, you need to make sure that the business that's representing you has got your sort of ethos there, you know, in terms of how you treat these customers, whether they be in vulnerable situations or not. So I think that's a great point.
Right, and just to say, I think if we take it back to the first poll that you did as well, you know, that one of the questions was around basically board level buy-in, and I think that is really critical. So one of the things the Energy UK vulnerability commitment requires of participating suppliers is that they have a board level or equivalent champion of vulnerability, because often in large and complex organizations particularly, you do find people in, whether it's in sort of propositions, products and proposition design and finance, who know nothing about vulnerability and assume that this is some kind of charity, you know, where we're just handing out free money to customers and that we don't understand the business and how it works. And, you know, the amount of time that you have to spend basically sort of explaining first principles to people. So I think it is absolutely critical. And that's one of the great things about BS 18477, so the British Standard for Inclusive Design and Inclusive Service, is it does actually require board level buy-in, and for that to sort of run through the organisation, I think that is absolutely critical. And sometimes we maybe don't pay enough attention to that.
It's the same as data protection by design, isn't it? It's just, except in the world of vulnerability, it's putting it into all aspects of development of processes and procedures. And I think, I mean, I did quite a lot around data protection with GDPR and stuff, and I saw the difference as soon as those big fines came in, and how there was board focus around that. And I think we probably need the same with vulnerability in terms of having it on that sort of level and that sort of focus on it, because I think there's a lot of talk and there's a lot of movement, but I think at the end of the day it does sometimes need that board level focus to really have a shift.
Definitely. And we spoke about the other day as well how we can sort of better equip, you know, frontline staff, you know, what sort of policies we could have, or, you know, technology obviously being there as well, but we spoke about things like intergenerational pairing. of sort of frontline staff to understand different issues that maybe young and inexperienced customer service staffs might not understand, you know, or have experienced just due to life circumstances. So generational pairing, was quite an interesting one for me, out with sort of technology and things like that as well, and being able to aid frontline staff.
Yeah, similar to Steve's point, isn't it, on kind of having champions and pairing and stuff. I think that's definitely getting it kind of permeating through the organisation is the core. I mean, an interesting thing that sometimes comes back to me when you start to talk about this is, are we expecting or asking too much of agents to be able to deal with all these complex cases, and does there need to be specialist handoffs and stuff like that as well? Because to the example that you said earlier, Helen, of someone who's got mental health, to be able to delve back into that conversation a year later is quite a complex situation for someone to deal with, and it's probably more than just training, being able to handle that, you know. So does there need to be specialist teams that do deal with some of these types of conversations?
I think that's why it needs to be dealt with by exception, Jamie. You know, that you have to whittle it down. I mean, going back to, then again, I go back to what Steve said. I think some of it is good customer service, and I think you can probably support a lot of people with just having really good customer service and helping them through. But some of those cases, you can't expect a team of 200 customer service staff to all know the nuances of everything that's going to hit them. It's impossible. It's so, yeah, I personally think there has to be certain cases that are dealt with by exception. It's perhaps minimising those as much as is possible, because we all know what there's targets, there's call times that need to be monitored and all the rest of it, but it's getting that balance, isn't it?
No, definitely. So anything from the audience in terms of thoughts, comments, observations on our last questions about, you know, the difference between agent soft skills and technology and how they can perhaps work together? Nope.
Yeah, I just like to share something. I think that particularly large organisations over a period of time have reduced customer service to very sort of transactional, functional methodology, which is replicable and highly efficient and manageable, and returns good or make good returns for shareholders. So I think we've kind of dehumanized a lot of the processes within our business so that they work as well as possible. I think all of the technology stuff, it can help, but in the training environments that I've worked in, what really works well is if we can try and rehumanize what businesses are actually trying to do, get them to articulate from a board level what their actual social purpose is. Apart from generating returns for shareholders, we're actually here to provide a service to individuals. And I think the pandemic has shown us that we're all vulnerable, and we're all, 24, 36, 12 months away from being in a really tough spot. And how we're going to manage that as individuals should be the thing that we need to focus on first. So yeah, the recognition that vulnerability is not some subset label of customer service, but it's what underpins the relationships with your colleagues, with your team leaders, with your customers. And organizations that really took that on and said, look, I know you've got targets, everyone's got targets. But if you come to me in the afternoon and said, look, I spent 40 minutes talking to this customer, they're in a really tough spot. We tried to help them out in this way. Maybe we can flex our processes a little bit. We have kind of pointed them in the direction of an agency that can help them. And, they've asked that I give them a call back in 3 months' time. Would that be all right if I do that? And the organizations say yes. And all of a sudden you have a relationship issue going on, a good relationship issue. And I don't think that we have relational approaches to doing very much in business. We don't manage staff relationships very well. We manage staff metrics. So it is that switch from transactional to relational, which is going to be a cultural shift. And, at the moment when everyone's resigning because they don't want to work in businesses where you know, they've been isolated, they're at home, they don't have any connection with their sense of purpose. These are really good kind of business messages which have got to underpin all of the how-to, all of the technology stuff. So I think, yeah, the board level has to take on the responsibility for what the purpose of their organization actually is within society. And then that's a real kind of key point to be able to address vulnerability from.
I mean, here, I could not agree with that more. And I think, you know, having worked at large organizations, multiple large organizations, where you see board level messaging, and it does set the right tone, but yet it doesn't filter through an organization into the operational enablement. That for me is the real challenge. It's very easy to stand up and, you know, I've heard multiple different CEOs and multiple different companies say, we put customers at the heart of everything that we do. And then you look at the practices and you're like, well, that's not exactly the case. So it's, you know, the big challenge is how you take these you know, these large sort of cultural statements and you know, embed them in with the artifacts, with the processes, with the remuneration reward. You know, like I say, there's a natural friction between the old style of business, transactional, just focusing on the bottom line, and then making these sort of nice cultural focuses come to life. It's really challenging, I think.
Definitely.
But I do think it's enabling. I think that's the thing. If we enable people to look into their own humanity and connect with another human being, then people just rise to the challenge, because it's the right thing to do. If you take the pressure off people's heads and actually get them to think in a way which is really kind of beneficial to themselves, if you can go home on a Friday afternoon saying, yeah, I spoke to 50 people this week and I know a handful of them I really helped out, rather than like, I spoke to 50 people this week, I should have spoke to 55, you know, how have I still got a job on Monday?
Yeah, exactly right.
Okay, I think that's all we've got time for today. I think this is a topic we could continuously talk about. We can maybe book out 2 hours for next time. But thank you very much, Helen, Steve and Helen, and for your participation, everyone. We will send you some outputs just after the meeting in terms of what we've discussed and make the recording available to you. But it was great to see you all, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Thanks
everyone.
all.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.